on the camera, that camera. Hello and welcome to our program, Afrocentricity. We have a very, very, very special program today. The name of the program is called From Visibility to Invisibility, the case for Afro-American, African-American studies in the Browning of America. And we have one of the founders of the field of black psychology, and indeed the very implementer of the first black studies department in the history of the United States, Dr. Joseph White. Dr. White, how are you doing?
Thank you, Dr. Mike.
Indeed, indeed. Now, before we talk about some of the books that you've written, this one is the most recent.
Yes, sir.
And of course, The Black Man Emerging and the Psychology of Blacks. Let's talk a little bit about yourself in terms of your background and how you got into all this stuff, this black study stuff. You were actually in San Francisco State University, a college at that time, it's called San Francisco State College, in 1968, when the first black studies program or department was being proposed, being conceived, and it happened as a result of your administration. You were the dean of the college of the dean of undergraduate studies there.
Yes, I was the Dean of Undergraduate Studies at San Francisco State in 1968. I had been a student there in the 1950s, and then I came back. And all of the black programs ended up being funneled through my office, and black studies was one of them. There was a 4.5-month strike about whether it should be a department or not, whether it should be a major, whether it should hire its own faculty, and at the end of the strike, everything was put on my desk, so then I put the program together and hired the faculty.
So you actually hired the first black faculty in the history of the United States.
I hired 11.3 FTE tenure track faculty.
It's funny you get that .3 in there.
I have 11.3. We figured out the number of possible courses we would teach, the number of possible enrollments, and the college gave us a formula, and it came out 11.3, and they still have 11.3 faculty to this very day. And then what's important is that the program actually expanded into an ethnic studies model, because during the strike the Asian students joined up with us, the Hispanics joined, and Native American, so we ended up with an ethnic studies model, and now they have a college of ethnic studies at San Francisco State, which I think is maybe one of the few in America.
Now, your field of study was psychology throughout the whole time. I mean, you had gone to school at San Francisco State, and your background was in psychology.
My background was in psychology, and when I was appointed dean, I actually had my FTE, my faculty line was in the psychology department. So I was a full professor of psychology, and I was the dean. But during that time, I began to shift gears into a black consciousness. So when I left black graduate school, I was like a black Anglo-Saxon. I had a black face, but I was a white boy in terms of my thinking, Freud, Piaget, so on. But as I went through the 60s and went to jail, voter registration, marching, Dr. King, and so on, I shifted into a black consciousness. So by the time I got to San Francisco State, as the dean, I was down with the brothers.
Okay, so you weren't really surprised when all that stuff jumped off, and you were really on board as administrator.
Yeah, I was on board. I was maybe, they were 110%, I was 80%. And then they moved me, Eldridge Cleaver and the Panthers and so on, moved me the other 20%.
Now, wasn't 1968 the same year of the Association of Black Psychologists organized? And weren't you a founder of that organization?
I was a founder of that organization in 1968. 11 black psychologists attended the meeting of the Big Psychology Association. So there were 11 black psychologists at a convention of 10,000 white psychologists.
Wow.
And there was a big confrontation that ensued. And so we had that weekend, we had connectedness, confrontation, and creativity. The confrontation was we were angry because blacks were invisible in psychology. I was the third black clinical psychology PhD in all of the history of America. I never saw a black psychologist in my life until I was 28 years old, and I looked at myself in the mirror.
You said you were the, what'd you say, third?
I was the third black clinical psychologist to receive a PhD in America.
And did you know the first two? Or you?
No, I never met the first two, but I know there were two more. and one of them has passed away, and I think one is retired up in Chicago, Rodney Prue.
And you wrote this article, and this article was published in Ebony magazine in 1970 called Toward a Black Psychology.
And that was the first official use of the term black psychology in the literature in America. And I deliberately put it in Ebony magazine because Ebony has 1 million readers and 5 people read every magazine, and I wanted the black psychology to be owned by the people rather than by an academic department. I wanted the psychology to reach the people, so I deliberately put it in that magazine.
Well, you know, one of the things that we just don't hear about is the role of black psychology in the development of the whole field of black studies. We hear about, you know, Malana Karenga, and we hear about Nathan Hare. Well, even when the history is written up of San Francisco State, you don't hear about the implementer. You don't hear about the administrator, if you will. You hear about those who were on the front line making it happen. But here we find out that black psychology is pivotal in the development of the whole concept of transformation of higher education to be more inclusive of black people because of your very, very presence. Let's say a little bit about your books.
Well, the books is, that's the 3rd edition of The Psychology of Blacks. The first edition came out in 1984, and what I wanted to do was write a small book that could be used for courses. People kept saying, well, we don't have a book to use. We don't know how to write a course outline. So I tried to write a brief book that would look at the history, look at identity, look at the family, look at mental health, look at education, and look at some of the issues for the future. And then I was fortunate to have Dr. Tom Parham as one of my students, who then expanded the book through the next 2 editions.
Now, was this one of the first books actually to be published on the topic? I know there was some that came out like anthologies. I can remember Reflections on Black Psychology that came out in the mid-70s.
There were 2 or 3 anthologies. Reginald Jones had a big anthology in the 70s, but I think this may have been the first or second book written by one author.
Okay.
So forth, and that was written with a sequence in mind, so that the students could follow from topic to topic.
And this book, The Black Man Emerging, which just came out in paperback, what would you say is your basic thesis that you assert here?
My basic thesis is that the images of black men in America are false. The image of the superstar athlete, the image of the pimp, the player, the image of the prisoner, the drug addict, the dope dealer, the absent father, and that these images are stereotyped. And I wanted to go behind the images and look at the psychological challenges that black men face from the cradle to the grave. I wanted to go behind the images, look at the challenges of achieving your dream, the challenge of building good relationship, the challenge of finding a source of strength, and the challenge of coping with racism. What are the challenges all black men face?
Now, your topic at Northern Kentucky University, you're going to be speaking there on from invisibility to visibility. And there is some question, I think, in America's mind, particularly in the field of psychology, is psychology a recognized discipline? Is black psychology a recognized discipline, if you will, within the field of psychology? How would you address that?
Well, it depends upon the lens you look at it through. All black psychologists in America, and there are now close to 1,000 of us, and we have a convention every summer. We'll meet in Denver this year. We have no doubt that it's a discipline within psychology. The traditional psychologists, white psychologists, some would say it is, and some would say it isn't. So it depends on the lens through which you view it. And as you know, in America, decisions are made in terms of who has the power. And right now, white psychologists have the power. But while we're arguing as to whether it's a discipline or not, the themes of black psychology are creeping into all of psychology. The theme of spirituality, the theme of hope, the theme of looking at strengths versus pathology, the theme of optimism. All of that is creeping into psychology as a whole, only they don't recognize we brought it into psychology.
So how will we get that recognition, I might suggest? Because, you know, things are always going to be constantly changing. And the poor African American would never get credit unless something happens to make sure that credit is there.
We have to remind our fellow psychologists that we were the ones who brought the concepts into psychology. Like psychology now has exhausted the pathology model, and they're looking for a way of identifying human strengths. We have to remind them that we've done that. We have to remind them that we brought the term resilience in. We have to remind them that we brought spirituality back into psychology, which had abandoned it 100 years ago when it wanted to be a science. So we have to remind them, because if we don't remind them, they will forget.
Is spirituality now, is that recognized? Because you might find psychologists, for instance, some of these accreditation people that say that we don't deal with parapsychology, we don't deal with emotionalism and that sort of thing. We don't deal with this stuff that's not real. If it can't be counted and measured, it's not really psychology. How can you count and measure?
Well, the new wave of psychology now is saying that spirituality is a piece of psychology, and they're saying it for this reason. As people age in America, they go through grief, they go through divorce, they go through loss. And we're finding out that one of the ways people try to recover or need to try to recover is to have a spiritual base. And we found that out. And as psychology itself has aged, they are finding that out. So that while there was tremendous resistance when I came into psychology to even mentioning the word, because we wanted to be a science, now that psychology is 50 years older and has been through many changes and lifespan development, it's coming back in. And as a matter of fact, now patients will ask a therapist, do you have a spiritual base? Are you a Christian? Are you a this? Are you a that? And we brought that in there.
So you're saying black psychologists introduced the whole notion of spirituality into the realm?
It's one of our central concepts. We introduced the notion of resilience. We introduced the notion of optimal living. And we introduced the notion of we no longer wanted to look at the pathology model because we felt there's no way you can find your strengths through looking at pathology all day long.
And you're saying that the traditional psychological approach was based on a pathological model?
Pathological model, an anti-spiritualistic model, and no recognition of things like resilience and optimism and hope and that sort. But now that's coming back. There was big, long series of articles in the American Psychology Journal on positive psychology, optimism, spirituality, and not one article mentioned us.
Mm-hmm. Again, invisibility. Mm-hmm. Psychology as a discipline, though, was just about 100 years or so. I mean, this is like 2001, and you might go back to, I guess, Wundt or so.
Mm-hmm. We're 122 years old, so it's a young discipline. And as a young discipline, it was trying to establish itself. But for the first 70 or 80 years of psychology, black people were invisible, one. So you can read all the psychology books up to 1970, and there's very little mention of blacks. On the other hand, when we did appear, we appeared under what I call the deficit deficiency model. We had a low IQ, we couldn't do a complex task, we couldn't plan for long-range goals, we couldn't keep our family together, we were not ambitious, lazy, so forth. So when we went to San Francisco, we attacked that deficit deficiency model. Mm-hmm. We confronted the American Psych Association about the invisibility of black people and the deficit deficiency model.
Would you argue that the ideal of psychology as a discipline has to be culturally, I don't want to use the word race because that's a specious classification, but culturally specific, that indeed the psychology of Europeans to be normal or normative behavior of Europeans might be different from Native American people or might be different from Asians? What would you say about psychology?
Well, I would say that psychology is made up of the lives of people, the stories and the experiences of the lives of people. So if you live in America, and soon in America, 50% of the people will be non-white, how can you build a psychology of only white folks when 50% of the people are non-white? So that you must include the stories and the experiences of the people in the psychology that you are building. And you can't build a psychology off of white males and then compare everybody else and say, well, they don't live up to what white males are, so therefore they're inferior. So we say that the psychology must be based on the lives of the people. So in this case, African American psychology must be based on the lives of the people. And if in the process we find universal values such as spirituality, hope, resilience, and so on, we have to first go through the cultural piece.
But the whole notion of norming, the whole concept of normative behavior, something that's psychological is healthy based on a norm, has to be looked at those people's stories, is what you're saying.
And those people's stories, and we have to acknowledge that there may well be differences between people, and you can have differences without having one person being better or worse. For example, people in the Get Down Baptist Church worship different on Sunday than people at the Episcopalian church that is white. And we can't start saying one is better than the other. We just have to say they're differences. You can have differences without deficiency. But what white people would do when they see us hollering and shouting, "Oh, Jesus," they say those black folks are acting childish. And we would say we're going through a catharsis and a bonding with Jesus.
Which you need to go through that,
right,
if you're gonna be healthy in the context of a society that have oppressed you and kept you out of the mainstream.
Right, and now you have white boys in the Bay Area gathering every Friday night to pound on drums and to shake tambourines, and that's called some kind of bioenergetic therapy. So that again,
when it comes back around,
yeah, and you have white people going to a dance club on Friday night to shake their bottom and their head and their eyes and their feet to get all the tension out.
Well, let me say this. In terms of the ideal of psychology, is there any notion of collectivity in terms of, because African culture is a collective culture. It's like there's one philosophical framework, I know, therefore I am, versus we are, therefore I am. Does that play
Well,
a
there's
role?
two pieces. In the American psychology, the focus is on the individual and, rugged individualism. In African American psychology, the focus is on the group of collective survival. In Euro-American psychology, the mind is primary, what exists from the neck up. What did Descartes say? I think, therefore I am. We say it the other way around. I am because you are, and because you are, I am. That we cannot exist apart from the group. And the mind and the body are a unit. You can't separate the two. We are all part of one process. Whereas the Europeans tried to extract out one part of the human being and say that's all there is.
Is that finding a place in traditional the group?
It's slowly coming back. It's slowly coming back. It's called interdependence. That rather than being totally independent and rugged individualists, we all need each other. And that's another concept we brought into psychology, connectedness to others as part of the human experience, rather than one being dominant. See, with white folks, you were connected, but one had to be dominant and one submissive. And we're saying no, connectedness as a group where each of us respect each other as equals.
Now, if the people in Germany, Wilhelm Wundt, for instance, he was, I think, credited with doing the first psychological study. And at the same time, the Germans were involved in carving out Africa, and as well as the other European countries, and creating this whole colonialism thing. So they couldn't very well see people of color as having the same psychological equivalence as Europeans at the time when they were coming up with this whole ideal of the field of psychology.
Well, Euro-Americans, Germany, and could I use the term on this show, white folks, have a certain way of viewing the world, and they have had trouble with contradictions. They cannot handle or have trouble handling contradictions. So on the one hand, they say that they are the highest peak of civilization, and on the other, they're over in Africa oppressing people, but then they say the reason they oppressed them was to help them become civilized. So we've had trouble with these contradictions. Right here in Kentucky, you had slavery. Across the river, you had non-slavery, and America is still struggling, and Cincinnati is still struggling with that contradiction.
Right. So there's no way they could include, if they're talking about creating a discipline to study the mind, how could they include those people as being human beings, or being worthy of making a contribution to this field of study?
And what happened is when they saw the people who were different than they were, and Africans were different from Europeans, they immediately went into this business, well, if they're different, somebody's got to be better and somebody's got to be worse.
Right.
Rather than saying, what can we learn from those people, and how can we set up mutual enrichment? How can we have constructive engagement? And that's the problem, that we don't know how to bridge the differences so both sides can grow.
Would it be a fair statement, correct me if I'm wrong, would it be a fair statement to suggest that the very discipline of psychology has in some ways helped to facilitate the oppression of those people?
Yes, I would say that a psychology is reflective of the society that it grows up in. So if you have a society that believes that black people are inferior, then the people who create that psychology in a society will also say that. So that when American psychology said that black people were dumb, that idea was already in the American culture. They just got an IQ test and demonstrate what they already believe.
That's right. And they created the IQ test out of their cultural norm.
Right. Right.
In fact, they used that IQ test against Southern Europeans.
Right, and Southern Europeans, or anybody who was different. But the psychology conformed to the norms of the culture. The psychology said that white males were superior. The culture said that white males were superior. The psychology said, and this is testimony in front of the United States Army Committee in Congress, said that black people couldn't do complex tasks. The society believed they couldn't do them. So that way, black kids couldn't fly an airplane or drive a tank. So that the psychology paralleled the society, and I guess your people over here call that the sociology of knowledge.
Okay.
That's what they call it.
Now you're going to be talking about from invisibility to visibility. Could you give us just a brief rundown of the themes you're going to try?
Yes. When I started San Francisco State in 1950, there were 50 black kids in a student body of 4,000. So we were there, but we were invisible. There were no black faculty, no black teachers, and no black content in the curriculum. The same with Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man. He said, America walks by us, doesn't see us. So we were invisible. Then through the strike and other things, we are now trying to become visible, and the Census Department says that we will soon be very visible because pretty soon 50% of America will be non-white. So we are trying now to become visible, and we're trying to become visible on the faculty, in the curriculum, on the administration, and we're trying to become visible as decision makers in society. And I maintain that there is a silent pulse in America that beats black. And if you want to see the black beat in America, you go to dance halls, you watch the way teenagers dress, you see what records they buy, and the existential themes in black literature are now creeping into literature as a whole. So that there's a silent pulse in America that beats black, but it's not recognized.
And you're saying that that's part of the psychology of America.
And we're trying to bring that now to the surface. We're trying to say that intertwined in America, in its music, in its dance, in its dress, in its literature, in its interactive styles, is a black pulse, a silent pulse. And we are trying to now bring that up to the surface.
That's very interesting.
Visibility to invisibility.
Now,
or invisibility to visibility.
Okay, because you're using Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man as a take on that.
Right, as a metaphor.
Now, right now, even as we talk, there's a lot of conflict happening in Cincinnati, Ohio. You know, the white police officers and even perhaps black ones have been engaged in killing African American people over the past few years. I think out of 17 people to be killed, 15 have been African Americans.
African American males.
African American males, exactly. Is there any role of a psychology department at a preeminent metropolitan university to play? Is there a role that could happen to work towards some psychological health in that environment? If we have a visible, you use the word from invisible to visible, healthy, functioning psychology department at a preeminent metropolitan university, what could such a department do?
Well, what a department could do is bring people to the table to begin to work toward constructive engagement. See, what's happening now in Cincinnati is what's happening in America. America wants now at this point peaceful coexistence. You let us alone and we will let you alone. We will keep the peace. Never mind the problems, as long as we can keep the peace. But when something erupts, we have no common ground from which to work. So the absence of an eruption does not mean things are working.
Right.
So the psychologist has to now put on the table, how can we move from peaceful coexistence to the next stage, which is constructive engagement? How can we begin to reconcile our differences and move forward? See, Nelson Mandela didn't say that the policy of South Africa is coexistence or oppression, for that matter. He said the policy is reconciliation and constructive engagement.
Right.
And psychologists then need to set people down and help them work through the barriers.
Because, well, basically you're talking about conflict resolution and mediation and that sort of thing, and there, like you have political science departments that could do some certain of that. What would be the difference between what a psychologist would do in this situation in terms of working with people versus a
psychologist should be able to sit down with people and help them work through the first two stages. There are 5 stages, but the first 2 involve a perceptual gap and the intensity of human emotions. The perceptual gap is that when black people and white people sit down to talk, they don't see the world in the same way. They may even use the same words. But when you say progress, it means one thing to black people, one thing to white people. You say O.J. Simpson, that means one thing to white people,
That's right.
one thing to black people. Yet we all watch the same trial.
Right.
So we live in different realities. And so when we sit down, we have to establish that those different realities exist.
Okay, real good.
That's number 1. And number 2 is there's a backlog of intense emotions that have built up on both sides over 381 years, and a psychologist has to help people, like in marriage counseling, process the intensity of those emotions.
And you're saying that an institution that fashions itself as a preeminent metropolitan one should have the kind of expertise in those departments to be able to work toward that kind of reconciliation.
Right, and that we spell out up front that these are the perceptual gaps and put them up on the table.
That's wonderful.
Like you do in marriage counseling. You put up the intensity of the emotions, and then people are going to have to spend some time externalizing blame before they can really do creative, reflective thinking. They first got to blame each other. Like my daughters say, I can blame white folks all day long. They say I'm carrying baggage from the last century. You know, they say I shouldn't even be in the diversity business. But after I've exhausted myself doing the blaming, then maybe I'll be ready to talk constructively.
This is good. This told us our time just ran out.
Okay.
This has been a magnificent discussion. Dr. Joseph White, involved in black studies from its very beginning, involved with black psychology from its very beginning, and one of the critical healers of our time. Dr. Joseph White, thank you.
Thank you.
Until next time, so long.